Why did they choose her? I've asked that question for years, not because she became CEO, because she almost didn't. The meeting had already lasted 4 hours. Every presentation had been delivered, the financial models had been debated, the legal risks had been reviewed, the consultants had answered every question. Outside the boardroom, assistants were already preparing the paperwork. The acquisition was expected to pass unanimously. It wasn't really a decision anymore, it was a ceremony. Around the table sat people with extraordinary resumes, former CEOs, investment bankers, industry veterans, people who had spent decades making billion-dollar decisions. If intelligence alone decided corporate success, this room was overflowing with it. The chairman looked around one last time. "Any final comments?" Silence. Then, from the opposite end of the table, someone quietly spoke. "Before we vote, can I ask one question?" Not a speech, not a disagreement, just a question. What happened next has fascinated me ever since. The room didn't become louder, it became quieter. People who had been confidently defending the acquisition stopped talking. One director looked back at the financial model, another reopened a report that had been sitting closed for the last hour. Someone who hadn't spoken in 30 minutes suddenly leaned forward. Nobody had been given new information. Nobody had changed the numbers. Nothing outside that room had changed. And yet, inside the room, something had. 20 minutes later, the acquisition was postponed. Months later, it was abandoned. Years later, people would quietly admit it was one of the smartest decisions the company never made. And eventually, the person who asked that single question became CEO. Now here's the interesting part. Almost every article written about leaders like her tells the same story. She was visionary, strategic, emotionally intelligent, a great communicator, a natural leader. Those descriptions sound impressive. They're also almost completely useless, because they describe the outcome. They don't explain the mechanism. Imagine watching a magician perform an impossible illusion. When the audience asks how he did it, someone replies, "He's talented." Technically, that's true, but it tells you absolutely nothing. Business does this all the time. It gives successful people beautiful adjectives instead of useful explanations. And when we don't understand the mechanism, we imitate the wrong things. Let's perform a little experiment. Close your eyes for a second. Picture the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Don't choose someone specific. Just notice the image your mind creates. For most people, it's surprisingly similar. Confident, energetic, walking quickly, speaking fluently, comfortable on stage, effortlessly social. The kind of person who enters a room and immediately becomes its center of gravity. Very few people imagine someone who pauses before answering, someone who listens more than they speak, someone who appears almost understated. That's interesting, because nobody consciously taught us to think that way. The image arrived through repetition. Movies, television, conference speakers, LinkedIn posts celebrating executive presence, business magazines with dramatic cover photos, books promising to make you more influential. Again and again, they quietly repeat the same message. Leadership is visible. Leadership is loud. Leadership dominates the room. Eventually, the message stops feeling like an opinion. It starts feeling like reality. So, ambitious professionals spend years trying to become more outgoing. They practice networking. They force themselves to speak earlier in meetings. They learn body language, voice projection, conversation starters, how to command attention, how to become memorable. None of those things are inherently bad, but there's a question almost nobody asks. What if attention isn't the thing being rewarded. Because something strange happens when you study people who repeatedly make exceptional decisions. You begin to notice that many of them don't fit the stereotype at all. Some are charismatic. Many aren't. Some love public speaking. Others avoid it whenever possible. Some dominate conversations. Others barely speak until they believe they have something worth changing. The stereotype begins to crack. And once it cracks, another question appears. If great leaders aren't consistently the loudest people in the room, what exactly are they doing differently? Before we answer that, let's eliminate the explanations that seem obvious, because if we don't remove the wrong answers first, the right one won't make any sense. Let's start with intelligence. Maybe the quiet executive simply understood the business better than everyone else. That would explain everything. Except, it doesn't. Around that table were people who had built larger companies, people who had survived recessions, people who had negotiated deals worth far more than this acquisition. Nobody in that room lacked intelligence. If IQ alone explained great judgment, every boardroom would make extraordinary decisions. They don't. Perhaps it was experience. That's another comforting explanation. We like to believe wisdom simply arrives with time. Spend enough years in business and you'll naturally begin making better decisions. But we've all met executives who've spent 30 years repeating the same mistakes. Experience accumulates. Judgment doesn't always. One director had been in the industry almost twice as long as she had. Another had advised governments. A third had completed more acquisitions than the rest of the room combined. Experience wasn't the difference. So perhaps it was authority. Maybe people changed their minds because she had power. Again, no. She wasn't the chair. She wasn't the founder. She couldn't overrule anyone. Nobody around that table had to agree with her. They chose to. That's a very different kind of influence. Now think about what we're left with. No superior intelligence, no greater experience, no greater authority, no emotional speech, no dramatic confrontation. Yet 20 accomplished executives collectively changed direction. That should bother us. Because every explanation we've been taught has quietly disappeared. And when all the obvious explanations disappear, that's usually when the real investigation begins. Imagine you're watching a detective solve a murder. Every suspect has an alibi. Every obvious motive falls apart. Every easy answer collapses. For most people, that's the frustrating part. For the detective, that's where the interesting work starts. Behavior works exactly the same way. The obvious explanation is almost never the useful one. Here's the first clue. Notice what the quiet executive didn't do. She didn't try to win the room. She didn't overwhelm people with confidence. She didn't interrupt. She didn't deliver a passionate speech. She didn't ask everyone to trust her instincts. Instead, she asked one question. That question didn't introduce new information. It reorganized information that was already sitting inside everyone else's mind. That's an enormous difference. Imagine dumping 1,000 puzzle pieces onto a table. All the information is already there. Nothing is missing. The problem isn't knowledge. The problem is organization. One person quietly turns 3 pieces around, and suddenly everyone else sees the picture. The pieces didn't change. The picture did. That's what happened inside that boardroom. She didn't change the facts. She changed the way the facts connected. Most people think influence is about changing opinions. It isn't. The deepest form of influence changes perception. And once perception changes, opinions change by themselves. Think about the last time someone asked you a question that stayed with you for days. Not because it was clever, because it made you realize you'd been looking at the problem from the wrong angle. You probably didn't remember the person's tone of voice. You probably didn't remember what they were wearing. You remembered the shift, the moment reality reorganized itself. That's what exceptional decision-makers create. They don't fill rooms with more information. They reduce confusion. This is why some meetings leave you exhausted. Everyone is speaking. Nobody is thinking differently. The conversation gets longer. The understanding stays exactly where it started. Other meetings feel almost magical. One sentence, one observation, one unexpected question, and suddenly 10 intelligent people begin connecting dots they couldn't see 5 minutes earlier. That's not charisma. That's cognitive leverage. And once you start looking for it, you'll notice it everywhere. A skilled surgeon doesn't impress you because they move quickly. They impress you because they know exactly where to cut. An experienced pilot doesn't calm passengers by speaking constantly. They calm them because every decision reduces uncertainty. The same pattern appears in military commanders, crisis negotiators, elite investors, emergency physicians. Different professions, different personalities, exactly the same invisible ability. They consistently improve the quality of everyone else's thinking, which raises a much bigger question. If that's the skill organizations actually reward, why have we spent decades teaching people to optimize for confidence instead? Because somewhere along the way, business quietly confused visibility with value, and those are not the same thing. Business has a habit of measuring the things it can easily see: who speaks first, who presents confidently, who networks effortlessly, who fills an auditorium, who dominates a meeting. Those things are visible. They're easy to notice. They're easy to reward. But the most valuable executive in the room often creates something that isn't visible at all. Better decisions. And those are much harder to measure. Think back to that boardroom one last time. What actually happened? Not what people said happened years later, not the polished story that appeared in annual reports. What physically changed inside that room? The numbers didn't change. The lawyers didn't discover a new clause. The consultants didn't produce another report. No new evidence arrived. The only thing that changed was how 20 intelligent people interpreted the evidence they already had. That's the hidden work. And once you begin looking for it, you start seeing an entirely different definition of leadership. The leaders who change organizations rarely begin by changing people. They begin by changing the quality of the questions. Because questions do something opinions can't. An opinion tells people what to think. A great question forces them to think. That's why questions are so dangerous. You can argue with an opinion. It's much harder to escape a question you've answered honestly yourself. Imagine two executives leaving the same meeting. The first says, "I convinced everyone." The second says, "I think everyone finally saw the problem." Those sound similar. They're not. One measures success by winning. The other measures success by improving collective judgment. Only one of those scales. Only one continues working after the meeting has ended. Now think about your own career. How many hours have you spent learning to communicate more confidently, to network better, to appear more executive, to become more persuasive? None of those skills are wasted. But imagine if all that effort was built on the wrong objective. Imagine if promotions at the highest levels weren't awarded to the people who looked the most confident, but to the people who most consistently prevented expensive mistakes. That would completely change how you'd prepare for your next meeting. You'd probably speak less. You'd probably listen longer. You'd stop trying to produce impressive answers. You'd start searching for better questions. Because somewhere between middle management and senior leadership, the job quietly changes. Early in your career, you're rewarded for solving problems. Later in your career, you're rewarded for recognizing the right problem before everyone else does. Those sound almost identical. They're worlds apart. One depends on expertise, the other depends on judgment. And judgment isn't simply intelligence, it's the ability to notice the assumption that everyone else has unknowingly accepted. That's exactly what happened in that boardroom. The future CEO didn't overpower the room. She exposed an assumption nobody had questioned. The acquisition wasn't abandoned because she had a stronger personality. It was abandoned because one carefully placed question forced everyone to see a risk that had been hiding in plain sight. That is what exceptional judgment looks like. It often arrives quietly. It rarely feels dramatic. In fact, if you're waiting for it to sound brilliant, you'll probably miss it. Because the best questions don't impress people. They clarify reality. Years later, when companies look back at moments that changed their future, they often remember the decision. They remember the CEO. They remember the outcome. What they forget is the invisible shift in thinking that made that outcome possible. History has a strange habit. It celebrates confidence. It remembers charisma. It photographs certainty. But underneath almost every remarkable decision is something history rarely notices, someone who quietly helped everyone else think better. So perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Not, how do I become the most confident person in the room, but, when I leave the room, do people understand reality more clearly than they did before I arrived? Because that may be the difference between someone who commands attention and someone who quietly changes the future. And history has a habit of confusing the second person for the first.